Okay. All right, Python fundamentals. So today's core assignments, so by the end of today, you should try to complete for loop basics 1 and functions intermediate 1. Okay, so those are the two core assignments for today. I don't know why it's functions intermediate 1 because there's no functions intermediate 2, but anyway, that's the name of the assignment. So those, your goal should be to complete those by the end of today. The assignment on the stack of recognizing Python, that's optional, and I would invite everyone not to spend too much time on it. It's a little bit tricky. So if you didn't get it, if you tried it and it was confusing, you're not alone. So if you feel free to skip that one. I'll tell you the optional assignments that aren't necessarily that helpful or beneficial. Any questions? Does anybody have any issues with that or try it or? Okay. All right, so Python syntax. So I know this is probably meaningless to you at this point, but I'm going to say this repeatedly just to sort of foreshadow and to get the point across. Everything in Python is an object. Does that mean anything to anyone? We just sort of. Does anybody what
everything's a collection, or at least has the capability of being a collection?
Everything's a collection. What do you mean by collection?
Well, I don't know. Isn't like you could describe an array or an object as a collection of information, right?
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I've never heard it characterized that way. That's good. Yeah. An object, I think of an object in programming as like an object in the real world. So my cup, right, is an object. I don't know if you can see it with the background, but it's an object is something that has properties and methods, right? It has colors, shape, size, it can hold liquid. So in Python, Python is very object oriented. And so everything is an object, meaning everything has like properties and methods. And we'll talk more about what that means as we go along. So what is indentation? What does indentation do in Python?
The notes that were often within inside a block of some
Yes,
sort.
exactly. So instead of curly braces, like in JavaScript, indentation basically shows you where a code block starts and ends, right? So when we're defining a loop or a function, we end the statement with a colon and then indent to basically indicate that it's part of a code block. And that's what I think makes Python so cool is it's like English, right? When we start a paragraph, we indent. So it's the same thing in Python. When we start a new thought or a new group of items that belong together, we use indentation. And so that kind of begs the question, what is a code block?
Lines that belong together.
Yeah, groups of code that belongs together, code that functions together or performs some task together, code that basically belongs together. And it's determined by indentation. The other thing they mentioned in Python syntax is the pass keyword, and pass is basically like a placeholder. So if you want to create a loop, but you don't know what you're going to put in the loop yet, or if you want to create a function, but you don't know like the body of the function yet, you can use the pass statement, because at this point, if we just had a colon here and we didn't put anything under it, we would get a syntax error. Okay, that's I think a dangling colon. I think that's what it's called. So we use the pass keyword to tell Python, hey, go ahead and ignore this error. We're going to come back to this later. Okay. All right. So data types. Why do we have data types? What are data types?
Core things within programming languages that allow us to use them with each other so that the code knows how it's doing, because everything has some sort of foundation to it. So strings, ints, floating point, long, short int 32 and 64, Booleans.
Nice. Yeah, exactly. The computer doesn't, like, if we store the words hello world, right, in a variable, hello world isn't anywhere on our computer, right? It's a series of zeros and ones that means that the computer uses to store the string hello world. So we have data types because basically the computer handles data differently. So again, everything in Python is an object, but that kind of raises the question, what is an object, right? So an object is an instance of a class. Okay, and again, that's probably doesn't mean a whole lot to anybody at this point, but I want to sort of keep repeating this because eventually it'll make sense. So we have two different types of data types. We have primitive and composite. So the primitive types are Booleans, numbers, the none type, which the platform really doesn't talk about at this point, but I want to emphasize that this is a primitive type. Does anybody know what the none type does or what the none type is? So none is like, if you've seen null in JavaScript, it basically means the absence of a value. Okay, so I could say that the balance in my daughter's checking account is nothing, right? Which is true, but it's sort of ambiguous because she's 8 years old and doesn't have a checking account, right? So if you say there's nothing in her checking account, well, it's because she doesn't have one, right? So it's different to say like the balance is 0 versus the balance is none, right? So none represents the absence or something that doesn't exist. And then finally, strings are the primitive. It's kind of primitive, but composite. It's kind of, there's a fine line between strings sort of, or kind of the borderline between primitive and composite. Question so far? All right. So the composite types are lists, which are basically just arrays in other programming languages, tuples, which is an immutable list, basically, and then dictionaries. And dictionaries are like associative arrays or objects in JavaScript.
Did you say unmutable?
Immutable, yeah.
Immutable?
Immutable. Meaning that, what is immutable? Well, that's a good question. What does immutable mean?
I
Can't be
think
modified.
X-Men mutation.
Yeah, so
can
to
change.
mutate means to change, right? Like a mutant is something that converts or changes, right? So immutable means it can't be changed. So once you establish a tuple, you can't add to it or take away from it. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so Booleans. What is a Boolean?
So true or false?
Yeah, it asserts that something is true or false. So notice that in in Python, the Booleans are uppercase. So it's uppercase T, uppercase F. So if you want to say, is the user logged in? True would mean yes, they are. Is the email valid? False would mean it's not valid. Okay. The other primitive data type, pretty straightforward, integers or floats. An integer is just like a counting number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And a float would be anything that's a fraction, right? So if we want to use fractions, we use the floating point, floating primitive data type. All right, and strings. So strings are also immutable. And a string is basically a sequence of characters. Okay, so numerals, the symbols, also spaces, right? So spaces are a character as well. So this is an example of a string in Python. So which one's the string? See, Ryan's doing the, quotations, right? So what is name?
The variable storing the string.
Right. So if we want to access this string, we can use the variable. So the variable is kind of like a box we put the string in, or a place in memory. We're telling the computer basically keep track of this string for me, and I'm going to put this label on. Okay, so we can oftentimes with strings, we're going to be concatenating strings or inserting variables into them. Okay, so we can use the built-in print function, and this next bit is going to be a little scary, so just brace yourselves. So this is the documentation for the string function in Python. Okay, so take a minute, look at this, read it, and tell me if it makes sense to anyone. Put your hand up if it made any sense at all. Okay, I'm not seeing hands. Sort of, right? So this is what another author, I can't think of his name, calls technical sophistication. So it's the ability to read something and not completely understand all of it. Okay, so you can kind of read through this and pick up bits and pieces of it, right? So I'm looking at this, I see print, I see this star, and I see objects. Then I see this sep, and it looks like a string of some sort. Then I see end, I see file, and then I see flush, which I don't know what that means. So this basically, the print function prints objects to the text string file, which basically sys.std out just means our terminal, right? It just means it's going to print to our shell, basically. Sep and end are what it's going to separate or end the objects with. So if we print, and the star means multiple, so we can give the print function multiple objects, and it will print each one of them. It'll separate them with an empty string, and it will end with a /n. What does the /n mean?
New line.
New line, right. So we can change this. We can alter these things. We can say, I want it to separate with a comma, or I want it to separate with a pipe, or whatever character we want. And we can also specify, I don't want the print function to end with a new line. I want it to be on one line, right? But the point is, we can give the print function multiple objects, and it will print each one given this format. So if we don't specify the separator, or we don't specify the end, it will automatically insert these. Okay, questions about that? Okay. All right, so the other way is strings with interpolation. So we have the F string, which is literal string interpolation, string.format, which is basically just the older version of the F string. And then finally, we have the %sign formatting, which is the older, more C-like syntax we use for interpolation. Okay, so for F string, if we have variables, first name, last name, age, we can insert the the character F in front of the string, and then we use curly braces for the variables. So if I have a variable first name, variable last name, variable age, if I put this F string in front, I can insert these variables into this string like this. Okay, so there's a similar version of this in JavaScript. They use the backticks. This is the more modern, more common version of inserting data into a string. Okay, so we're going to use this a lot going forward. Whenever we need to insert information into a string, we're going to use this F string format. Okay. Okay, so Corey asks, is there any reason to use the older versions? And yes, there is. When we get to Flask and we're inserting data into a database, we'll use the older version. And that's because it's the database we're going to be using is SQL, is written in C. So the syntax is very similar to the C programming language. So generally, you're not going to need to use the format string. There's no real reason to use this. This is prior to Python 3.6, I believe. The way to insert variables into a string, you put the string And I put the F there, that shouldn't be there. That was a mistake on my part. So the string and then dot format, and then you would insert the variables into the in the dot format function. And it has the same effect, but again, this version is the preferred modern version. Okay, we'll get practice with both, but this one you don't really see anymore unless it's legacy code that's using Python 3.6 or before. And then the percent formatting, again, this is a holdover from C. So we use the %S, the S stands for string. So if we want to insert a string, we say %S, we say the type, and then %D, D is for digit, and then the %sign, and then the in parentheses, we put the variables. Okay, so when we get to Flask, we'll be seeing this again, something akin to this, not exactly like this, but it's similar enough that they introduced this as a way to interpolate strings. Question so far? All right, and then the none type, basically none just means nothing. And then and we'll talk about none when we get to functions. Yeah, okay. Right now, actually, I want to do a demo of the first practice exercise. So let me stop